We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
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 All right, well, we'll mute you all and we'll see you in a bit. All right, so then I'm going to share this one. And then I'm going to make sure that I have some security here so nobody else can share their screen. All right, so Leviticus. So remember, next week we have Numbers, and the following week we have Deuteronomy, and then in Lent we will do Job and some other things. I didn't put the calendar up this time, but it's there from last week and it hasn't changed. So jumping right into Leviticus. So last week we had Exodus, and remember how I said last week that there were two major parts of Exodus. There was part one, the exciting part, and part two, the boring part. And just to give you a sneak peek, Leviticus picks up right where Exodus left off. So Leviticus, back when I was in seminary, I took a study on the Old Testament in pre-theology. It was my first year of the seminary. And I loved my class on the Old Testament, which inspired me then to stay at the seminary for spring break. And I decided I was going to read the Bible read the Old Testament from beginning to end. That was my plan. I think I've shared that story before. We had a 2-week spring break, and something ended up bringing me back home eventually, but I did spend 1 week reading the Old Testament, and I got, I think, as far as the book of Tobit in that week reading the Bible. But as I was setting off for that journey, one of my friends, he's a priest now in the diocese, Father John Pilcher, who's in Topeka, I remember him saying, I told him that I was going to do this project, and he said, just skip Leviticus. So it's sometimes considered a skippable book, but there is a lot in here that is pretty interesting and good. And although it's not the favorite book of anyone that I know, it still has some important details. So in some ways, Leviticus, if First John is everything that we want the Bible to be, Leviticus is perhaps everything that we don't want the Bible to be. Rules and laws and do this, don't do that, this is clean, that's unclean, all these antiquated ways of talking and everything. But I think also, and hopefully what we can do through this little study here is just to open up that there is some real beauty here in Leviticus. And I would argue perhaps that Leviticus is a little bit of an underrated book, and possibly Numbers is a bit of an overrated book. Because Numbers continues along with the boring part, if you will, but it's a lot about counting tribes and people and it's a little bit like doing a census study, and that might be really interesting to people, but it can be kind of a drag to read through. So going back, I would probably say if you skip one book, skip Numbers, or at least the first half of Numbers, rather than skip Leviticus, because there's some really good and important stuff that happens here in Leviticus. So Leviticus, just kind of basic background intro. The scope is right after the Exodus. So not much time passes in this book at all. The narrative comes to a halt here, as it has from basically the second half of Exodus. We put on the brakes, and now we're going to talk about what God is asking us to do and how to live. So it's the third book of the Pentateuch. and there's almost no narrative. We'll get to the little bit of that. It's a little bit like reading the Code of Canon Law, which is generally not too engaging of reading. People don't generally sit down and say, okay, I'm going to read the Code of Canon Law. The Catechism is way more interesting than the Code of Canon Law, and there's many, many very beautiful parts of the Catechism. The Code of Canon Law really is exciting for some people, not so exciting for most people, but that's kind of what it reads like. And yet the Code of Canon Law is something that's very important in our church. It's very important that we have these laws so that we know how to live, what is just, what is unjust, if somebody wrongs me in some way, what can I do about that? It's all very important stuff. It just doesn't make for great nighttime reading, I suppose. So the root of Leviticus comes from the word Levi or Levite. And remember, that's one of the sons of Jacob. And it is the son of Jacob that does not get land himself, one of the tribe that does not get land himself, but that's the priestly tribe. So in some way, this is Levi's book or the priest's book. It's for help for the priests, help for the Levi to kind of guide the sacrifices, to guide the way of living. So if we read it in that sense, I think it's helpful that this is a book that's not a story book like Genesis is. It's a rule book, which are good to have, and it's important to have. So through all these laws and regulations, I think what is important to recognize is, and a good way to think of Leviticus is, God cares about the details of our lives. So you've heard the phrase, don't sweat the small stuff, it's all small stuff. And that's kind of a modern phrase. Don't sweat the small stuff, it's all small stuff. For Leviticus, it's sweat the small stuff, and there's a lot of small stuff. So that's one way to think of Leviticus. But I think it can also be helpful because there are a lot of small things in our lives, and sometimes, many times, big stuff come from the small stuff, right? So I don't just generally start off by murdering somebody, right? And that's what Jesus kind of plays out in the Sermon on the Mount. I don't generally just say, I wake up this morning and I'm going to kill this person today. I don't do that ever, but I don't think anybody does that, right? It starts off with, I don't like people. I don't like this person. This person really is terrible. This person drives me nuts. And it grows from there. And what Jesus says is not really unlike Leviticus, is work on those small stuff. You have heard that it is said, you shall not kill your brother. But I say to you, if you even have an evil thought against your brother, or you shall not commit adultery. But a man who looks at another woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. It's trying to get at that root of the sin. And in many ways, Leviticus does that as well, just from a little bit of a different perspective. It's small stuff, and work on that small stuff because the small stuff matters. The way that we live our lives matter. Or for people that are trying to do a weight loss program or whatever, I don't know about you, but I'm getting a lot of ads in my Facebook feed nowadays about losing weight. It's like, wow, is there a can they detect on my mouse pad that I'm a little heavier? I think probably a lot of us, it's a New Year's resolution. I'm going to be healthier. But one of the premises then of losing weight is, what do we take in? And that's kind of the principle of Weight Watchers. There's this thing coming up on my feed a lot called Noom. And I think that's one of the details, is we see what are we putting into our mouth. And you think, it's just a candy bar. Yeah, but that has like 850 calories in it. And if you eat one candy bar or whatever, what have you done? And so paying attention to those small things, it's one of the principles of Weight Watchers. We don't realize how much stuff we put into our mouth over the course of the day. And it's like, oh, I'm just going to eat a few peanuts. And we don't realize that we've eaten 30 peanuts. A peanut, so small, but now you've eaten 30 of them, and now we've got a problem. So the details of our lives do matter. And that's one of the things that we take in mind with Leviticus. Those details matter. So let's pay attention to them. And that's what Leviticus calls our mind to. And so I'd encourage you to, as you read Leviticus, to think of it as God's way to give structure to the lives of the Israelite people in that time and place. To give structure to the lives of the Israelite people in that time and place. Some of those things are still applicable today, and some of them are not. And we'll go through that a little bit here as well. Several years ago, I went and visited a Carmelite monastery of religious sisters. This was not it. This is just taken from some image on the internet. But for the sisters, they are not allowed to go out and visit, to go out in the world. So they have this, I forget what that thing is called, but gate kind of thing. You see the people on this side that are not in the habits, they are not religious sisters. It's kind of obvious, which ones are the religious sisters? Well, it's the ones in the habits, right? So on that side is the convent, and on this side is the outside world. And I remember going and visiting this convent when I was in seminary in Chicago, and some of these sisters had not left the convent ever since they basically entered, and they were in this religious order. And the rules were pretty strict. They could not leave. Now, barring sometimes they would leave for a doctor's appointment, and some of the superiors left for various purposes related to the order or whatever. They need to go talk to the bishop or go talk to another monastery or whatever. But the general rule was you did not leave the monastery ever. And your whole life was there. Now, for many of us, that sounds ridiculous and that sounds strict. And why would you do such a thing? But for many of these religious sisters, it was their way for holiness. And they chose to enter into this relationship in the community of the sisters. And I think that's a good way to think of Leviticus, that this is the community that God has chosen them, and they have said yes. And so if you are going to be part of this community, what does it mean? And we have particular rules and regulations that you will follow if you are going to be part of this community. So I think that's a helpful way to think of it. And the rule book that would be associated, there is a rule of life. And this rule of life is meant to be helpful to us, not to be a burden. I know I've spoken about this before, I'll speak about it again, that there are rules for the priesthood that I need to follow. One of those, for instance, being celibacy or the praying of the liturgy of the hours. And I am so grateful for that gift that God has given me of celibacy, of this life of the priesthood, of this way that God has called me to live. I'm so grateful that God has given me that call and has given me the grace to accept that call and to live that call as faithfully as I can. I am very grateful for that, and that is my salvation. I shudder sometimes to think of what I would be without the priesthood. That's for me and my spiritual director and for confession, I suppose, and not on a broadcast internet talk. But this is my salvation. I know that very personally, that these rules and regulations and how I am called to live is my salvation. I'm very grateful to it. And so you talk to anyone that's faithful to their vocation, that loves their vocation. You talk to any of these sisters behind that gate that love their vocation. Now, there might be some amongst them that are questioning, what did I get into and what am I doing here? And I need to leave or whatever. There might be some of that, but anyone that is authentically called to that and is living that faithfully, they will recognize, and I'm pretty sure that they will say, I am so glad that I'm behind this gate because this is my salvation. I would be a mess if I was outside the gate and in a different place. So that they're grateful for that. So as we read Leviticus, think of that as this structure, this rule of life that they are called to live, and that is meant to be their salvation, not their punishment. We sometimes think of Leviticus as a punishment after to read this, or God is smiting us, or God is angry, or whatever. No, it's live this way. So Leviticus, kind of what's the basic structure, or what's in there? What actually do we cover here in Leviticus? There's a lot that we do cover. We hear details about sacrifices, which I'll touch on a little bit, but is a little bit less interesting for us, perhaps. But how do we make sacrifices? There's a little bit of story in here. We hear the story of Aaron's ordination, chapters 8 through 10. We get clarifications on cleanliness and uncleanliness. We hear about the holiness code. What does it mean to live as a holy person? And we have details about what the liturgical calendar will look like. What are the feasts that we're going to celebrate as a people of God? We have liturgical calendars too. It doesn't, and I sometimes talk about this. Okay, we have ordinary time and Easter and Christmas, and when does Easter fall? And there's this whole formula of how Easter falls after the, whatever that formula is, after the first full moon of the spring equinox, or whatever the thing is. But there are details of how that is planned, and we read about that in Leviticus. Not Easter, obviously, but the other feasts. So again, I would stress the theme of Leviticus is holiness. That's the theme, not God smiting us or obey a bunch of rules, but how are we holy? So perhaps the quote of Leviticus would be this: "For I, the Lord, am your God. For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall keep that and make and keep yourselves holy, because I am holy." So God is holy. So let's be godlike. Okay, what does that mean to be godlike? Are we godlike only on one day of the week, or are we godlike on every day in the week? And are we godlike just part of the day, or are we godlike the entire day? And so the idea is every moment of every day, be godlike, be holy, because God is holy. Now, what comes out is a bunch of shalls and shalt nots, but again, the point is holiness. Remember that phrase of the Tetragrammaton, the Lord's name, that is holy. Remember, and we don't even say that word. We say the Lord, recognizing the holiness of God. The main characters of this book, if you will, are God, Moses, Aaron, and then his sons play a little role as well in this book. But there's not much story, there's not much character. But let's talk a little bit about the events that happen in Leviticus, because there's a little bit of story, a little bit of narrative. The story moves a little bit. And basically, these are the elements that we have. We have the ordination of Aaron. Okay, so we hear in chapter 8, verse 10, Moses poured some of the anointing oil on Aaron's head, and thus consecrating him. And then in 12, and then he consecrated him. He put it on Aaron's head. It's a fairly important event because it really is the birth of the Levitical priesthood. It's sometimes called the Aaronic priesthood. Isn't it ironic? Isn't it Aaronic? The Aaronic priesthood, where how are the people to be holy? In many ways, the priests will help them be holy. So it's the establishment of the priestly class. And this is handed on through the family. The line from which the priests come, they are all of the line of Levi, of Aaron. And this is different than the line of Melchizedek. So remember in Hebrews, we hear about that you are a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek, not in the line of Aaron. So remember the story of Melchizedek, who blessed Abraham. So before Abraham, there was Melchizedek, and Melchizedek was a priest and a king, and Jesus is a priest and a king. So Jesus is a priest, not of Aaron, not of these ways of sacrifice in the temple and all those things, but Jesus is a priest in the line of Melchizedek that we heard about in Genesis. So Jesus's priesthood predates the law that we get here in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And some say that the letter to the Hebrews should actually be read in conjunction with Leviticus. So kind of read those side by side. So Leviticus is like the old priest book, and Hebrews is like the new priest book. And that might be a helpful way to think of. Remember, Jesus was not of the line of Levi, he was of the line of Judah. And Paul was of the line of Benjamin. So he is a priest of a different order. Of course, the priesthood that we have in the Catholic Church, that is in the line of Melchizedek. That's in the line of Jesus Christ, not in the line of Aaron. So I am not a Levite priest. That has been done away with in the new covenant. We have a new order that has been restored, the line of Melchizedek. And that's who Jesus follows. And that's who the priests here follow. And so people sometimes get confused, for instance, when they read the book of Hebrews and they're talking about the priests offering sacrifices day after day. And people think of, oh, I know the word priest, and the priests are those Catholic priests that are up there doing the sacrifice and the holy sacrifice of the Mass or whatever. And that's not important because Jesus' one sacrifice is the sacrifice that matters. That's not what Hebrews is talking about. Hebrews is talking about the old priesthood of the Levitical priesthood. And now with Jesus Christ, the one true sacrifice, we have a new priest who offers himself as the sacrifice instead of the Levites offering it. So when I offer the Mass, for instance, it's not Father Kent offering the Mass. Sometimes people say, who's offering the Mass? And sometimes I want to say, Jesus. I know people are asking, is it Father Ashmore or is it Father Kent? Jesus. Because it doesn't really matter. It's not me that's offering the Mass. It's Jesus Christ. And we are just standing in his place and saying those words so that people can hear them. So I am in the flesh. And especially as I say those words, a little bit of a tangent here, but as I say those words, this is my body given up for you. Those are obviously not my words. That would be really weird. This is my blood. It's not my blood. It's Jesus's blood, Jesus's body, that I am just saying the words as the priest standing in place of Jesus, because he is not in each community the same way that he was 2,000 years ago. I am now standing in his place. So that's the role of the new covenant priesthood in contrast to the Old Testament priesthood that we hear about in Leviticus. So that's one of the events. Few other things happen in Leviticus. So Aaron's sons die, who are also appointed in this line. Nadab and Abihu offer unauthorized sacrifice. So there they are. The Brick Testament, or the Brick Bible, or whatever that thing is called nowadays. It used to be called the Brick Testament. And they were struck down by fire, or perhaps lightning. So there they are, those poor sons. They've been struck down. So then what else happens in Leviticus is Aaron's other sons do not eat. So I'm getting really desperate for narrative elements. If this would have happened in Genesis. Oh, two sons didn't eat. Well, we'd pass right by that. But we're so desperate for narrative in Leviticus. I'm like, oh, something else happened. They didn't eat. So they were supposed to eat the leftovers of the goat, and they don't, and says they were unworthy to eat anyway. The other story element that we have is that we have this stoning of the blasphemer. Remember how important it is to reverence the name of God. So we have this unnamed man. His heritage is from Dan, an Egyptian. And he commits this major sin of blasphemy. He spoke against God. He took the name of the Lord in vain. He spoke very blasphemous things. And the punishment for this blasphemy is that he gets stoned. They took him outside the camp and they stoned him. So we hear about that in chapter 24, which is where we have this famous passage, limb for limb, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, which again, Jesus is going to take it to the next level, but recall that this is taking us to the next level here already. Because remember that, what was it that we had in that story in Genesis? And gosh, I should have reviewed, but the story where it's Jacob's daughter, I think, that is done bad things to Dinah, and bad things to, and then the brothers revolt, and they go and say, you can have our sister if you just become circumcised and whatever. And so they all get themselves circumcised. And meanwhile, while they're in that pain, they go out and they slaughter them all. And so this is, again, it's an advancement. Okay, if somebody kills another person, the payment of that should be death, right? So 1 for 1, not 24 for 1 or 160 to 1. It's 1 for 1. So that is an advancement. That's an important thing to remember, because where were we in Genesis? We had lots of this violence. This is calling us to justice, and Jesus carries that justice further, even so, and carries it through this to who is our merciful God. And what does that mean? Justice still exists, and justice still will be done, but it is understood in a different way through Jesus. So just keep that in mind, that this is an advancement. It sounds so brutal to us, but it is an advancement from the greater brutality of where we were before Leviticus. That's basically all of the story elements that we have in Leviticus. So there ain't much, but that's it. And especially the ordination of Aaron, that's a very key moment. So if you skip past Leviticus, you miss that, and you miss this very important part for the rest of the Old Testament, is this role of Levitical priesthood. And you're like, wait, what did I miss? Did I miss something there? Yeah, so that is an important advancement of the story that we have in Leviticus. So the first part of the book talks about sacrifices. And we think of this all in the context of cleanliness and holiness. Now, I've recommended this book before, but I will put it up here again. In this book, Brant Petrie goes through a nice explanation of holiness and cleanliness and what that means and what it means to be holy and what it means for things to be clean and how unclean things can't be made holy. And it's a very good understanding of what happens and why we have sacrifices. But the idea is the word sacrifices comes from sacra, meaning holy, and facet, meaning to make. So that's the Latin root of this word. We have these sacrifices, so to make holy. So the idea, again, if the theme of Leviticus is holiness, well, what happens if you become unholy, or if the community becomes sinful, or if someone becomes sinful? What do? Well, you make sacrifices. How do you get back in if you have been cast out from the holiness? You make sacrifices to be holy again. That was the understanding, that you give of these things that are important to you, you offer the cereal offering or the bread offering, or you offer the animals, or you offer these things that are very important to you, and you offer them up in sacrifice to recommit yourself to God. It's a beautiful way for us to think, right? So we have, of course, as Catholics, we have the sacrament of reconciliation. So what happens when we become unholy personally? Well, we can go to the sacrament of reconciliation, the making holy again through the sacra, and then we are brought back into the community, and we do a penance, we do some sort of sacrifice to make holy again. We either are asked to do a prayer, or we asked to do a work of charity, or we're asked to do something to bring ourselves back through those sacrifices we make right. But then also, like, if the community sins, what do? Sometimes we have a communal penance. Was it John Paul II, I think it was, that did this whole kind of prayer, and I don't remember when it was, but was calling upon fasting and prayer for the entire church community for sins committed in the name of the church throughout the century. And it was this whole list of things that the church needed to repent of, for the anti-Semitism that has been present in the church, for the persecution of all kinds of peoples throughout our history. And so as a kind of a broad penance, fasting, asking ourselves to be made holy once again, because we as the church have been unholy. The idea is we need to re-holyize, re-sacramentalize the entire community. So this is really rooted in this idea from Leviticus, that once we become unholy, how do we get back in? And so we do this really concrete way of getting back in. So you can think, as you are offering this burnt offering or this cereal offering or this animal sacrifice, we are brought back into communion. And so then again, this is a movement from more brutality, if you will, into less brutality. We look at this stuff and like, what are we doing? Sacrificing animals and birds and whatever. And again, a lot of this time sacrifices were then eaten by the priests or whatever, right? So it was a way also to support the priesthood, if you will. I offer this goat to the temple, which then the priestly class will then eat. So it wasn't just like a waste, like we're just going to burn this up and it's done. But it was, if you will, a little bit like a tithe, if you will, or a sacrifice. I am going to support the priests. You know, in some countries, this is still kind of present, as I understand. that, not all, especially like developing countries, not all of the priests like get a salary or a livable salary. And so they really depend upon the sacrifices of the people where they are. And so sometimes people will like come and offer the priest, here are some eggs from my farm, or here's it, I brought you a chicken. If anyone brings me a chicken, I'm like, what am I going to do with this? But for some communities, I mean, that I need to eat, right? And so how am I going to eat? And if there's no money for me to go buy anything, and if the people can't give any money, well, how are we going to support the priest who is trying to serve us? In many ways, this is also the way to support the Levites. And they do not have their own land, right? So they don't have a way to grow crops. They don't have a way to support themselves. How are we going to support the priests? Well, we make sacrifices. The rest of us 11 tribes, are going to make sacrifices on behalf to support our priests. And so that's another way to think of these things. So it's a movement from, then again, this brutality to less brutality, and recognizing this theology of the life is in the blood. So if it's in the blood, if we have committed sins through our own person, well, how do we make that right? Well, we make it right through the atonement through blood, which can then be transferred, if you will, this was the theology, to an animal that also has blood. So depending on the sin or whatever, remember the near sacrifice of Isaac to Abraham. I mean, how much do you love God? How much will you sacrifice? And so instead of sacrificing children, we sacrifice these goats, and then in turn are often used in the life of the priests. And again, if you are a farmer or whatever, sacrificing an animal, that's a big deal. There was back in the day, there was a program to support our seminarians. There was God's little green acre or something like that, where it was an opportunity to engage the farming community here in Northeast Kansas to support the seminarians. And the idea was they would sacrifice 1 acre of their farmland, and whatever money that was made from that acre, they would give to support the seminarians. That's the same kind of premise. It's a big deal to give up an acre or to give up 10 acres or whatever. I'm not going to keep this for myself. I'm going to give this to others. That's the premise. It's a sacrifice. We also hear in Leviticus, we hear about the liturgical calendar. Now I'm skipping forward a little bit here in chapters. I went over there to Exodus. Chapters 23 and following. We hear about the holidays. Where did my notes go? So first of all, of course, we have Sabbath, which we talked about quite a bit last time in the, as we talked about through Exodus. Sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself. So it's celebrated many times during the year. So it's like the Sunday celebration. Sabbath, of course, is every Saturday for the Jewish people, the day of rest. And we went into great detail about that in Exodus. So we hear about the importance of the Sabbath and that we must rest. And again, that's for our good. It's not for our pain. Oh dear, I have to rest. No, it's for our good, and we take it very seriously. And if we don't take it seriously, that's a grave offense against God. Again, I think Sabbath rest is really needed to be heard in our world today, especially as so many of us are workaholics, and we don't take time to rest. We don't take time to be with family. We don't take seriously. This is a command. Stop. Don't do all these things. Rest. You need time to get good sleep. You need time for prayer. You need time with family. That's all very important. So it's a commandment. Rest. So then we have the feast, of course, of Passover, which is the recognition again of the Exodus event that's to be held annually, to remember that. And again, it goes into detail. So if you look on chapter 23, verse 5, it says, the Passover of the Lord falls on the 14th day of the first month at the evening twilight. The 15th day of this month is the Lord's feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first of these days you shall hold a sacred assembly and do no such of work. On each of these 7 days you shall offer an oblation to the Lord. Then on the 7th day you shall again hold a sacred assembly and do no sort of work. So again, it really lines out the details to which faithful Jews still follow this same pattern today. So we get the calendar here. It happens right here in the scripture in Leviticus. We have the Feast of Pentecost, which I always thought of as that's a New Testament thing. That's a Holy Spirit feast. No, it's the Feast of Pentecost is as Easter really is a completion of Passover, which works really much better in Spanish, by the way, because it's La Pascua, and it's the word for Passover is Pascua, and which is the word for Easter. So it really easy transition there. So Pentecost is another feast. It's basically kind of our Thanksgiving holiday, if you will. It's celebrating the harvest, if you will. When I was doing Tobit years ago, when I was writing that, that's another story about, I got confused about my words about Pentecost and Passover. I thought, oh, I'm so stupid. What was I doing? It's not past Pentecost. But no, it is Pentecost. So we have the Feast of Booths. It's also called the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Weeks, or whatever. People would go out and stay in booths rather than coming back and forth from the fields. So it's the fruit harvest. So they'd go and harvest the fruits and then go and then stay in the booths. Remember how Peter said we should go and build those 3 booths? It's that same kind of, that feast, right? That same kind of idea. It really sounds quite fun because it's kind of like a big barbecue or whatever. It's like you're coming together, you're harvesting together, you're going to your tents and you're harvesting and going back to the booths, you're praying together. So sometimes, I don't know if you've ever been to those barbecue festivals, but there are barbecue competitions. Especially, I really like the night before, because that's when they're all setting up and there's lots of conversation. They're talking amongst each other, and it's really quite fun. So the Feast of Booths is not entirely unlike that. And then during the day, of course, they're working on their competing and stuff. It's still fun, but they're more focused on what they're doing. Not entirely unlike the Feast of Booths, where they come together, they put all these tents up, they go out and they work, and then they come back and then they're in their tents together and talking and singing and praying and whatever. So it can be a very beautiful celebration. This is what you do. And so it's taking normal life and sanctifying, holifying it. Then, of course, there's the Day of Atonement, which is also called Yom Kippur. This is a very big feast of the Jewish year. It's a day of serious fasting. It's a day of reckoning. There's nothing to eat or drink on that day. It is the cleansing of the priesthood and the temple. It is a time nowadays for Jewish people to re-examine their lives and how well they coincide with God's command. So it's a day of great fasting, reckoning. Yeah, I suppose the closest thing we have to that would either be Good Friday or Ash Wednesday, perhaps, and maybe a combination of those two, which are our only 2 days, I think, of our liturgical year that are mandated fasting days. I think those are the only 2. We have abstinence days on Fridays, but I think fasting, I think there's only those 2. So we have this passage, this then shall be the everlasting ordinance for you. Once a year, atonement shall be made for all the sins of the Israelites. So remember, we have these personal sins by the people, and then we have this one day for the entire nation. How do we make the nation holy again? We also hear about this sabbatical year that we take, that every seventh day we take a rest. The idea is every seventh year we take a rest as well, and we rest the land. We take a rest from these hard works, and we give a pause. And that's where the idea of a sabbatical year, that sometimes priests will go on, or university professors will take their sabbatical year. It's obviously not every seventh year, but it's that premise follows that. So sometimes we need a rest from our labors to kind of retool. Someday I would like to take a sabbatical. I don't know what I would do with a sabbatical, but it's usually a time for a studying or retooling. So one day I'd like to do that. Many priests have done that. We've got a few priests that are on sabbatical right now. Sometimes people get confused with sabbatical and a leave of absence by a priest. Those are two different things. A sabbatical is it's not like a priest is in trouble or anything or needs some retooling. It's a time to restudy, and like I haven't taken any really deep theology classes since seminary, and you can get a little rusty on those things. I took some Spanish classes when I was down in Mexico, and that was there for a month. It's kind of like a sabbatical, I guess, because I was studying and getting ready for a new mission. But it was only a month, and it wasn't doing like theological study. So that's the idea for a priest anyway, is to take a sabbatical to, if we've gotten a little sloppy in our theology, or it's very hard for me to keep up with all the stuff that comes out. Someone was put out a letter concerned that we as a church have not read, like Good Shepherd Church has not read the latest encyclicals as a group. We have not read Fratelli Tutti, and have not read the environment one, whatever that one is called. I can't remember the name at the moment, but was a little upset that we hadn't. What are we doing to put these things into practice? And part of my response is, I haven't even read Fratelli Tutti yet. And it's like, why have we put this into practice? Like, I haven't had time to read it yet. So it just came out in like October. So give me a moment. The sabbatical year is meant to really help priests to kind of, oh yeah, what's come out in the past 20 years since I've been ordained, and how can I apply these well? So you just get caught up in the daily life of things, and you can't do all these other pieces. So that's what a sabbatical year is meant to be. And then we have the Jubilee year, which is every 50 years. And we had a Jubilee year back in the year 2000, if you recall, the year of Jubilee. And it was very exciting. So theoretically, I think we will have another Jubilee year in 2050. I could still be alive then. So in another 30 years or so, I think it'll be a Jubilee year. I don't necessarily that needs to follow exactly, but I think that there were some like small groups and stuff that were doing that. Renew 2000 was one of them, is to kind of prepare people for the Jubilee. It's a year of greater celebration and attention. So we had the Jubilee year of 2000. And so this 50th year, you shall make sacred, make holy, sacrifice by proclaiming liberty in the land for all in its inhabitants. So at that time, the slaves were set free, debts were canceled, land was given back. It was a time of great jubilation. So it was something really to look forward to. You just kind of got a fresh start, and now we'll start again. So whatever debts you had, canceled. Great opportunity for a reset. One of, I think, the gems of Leviticus, and I think I talked about this in a homily a year or two ago, was this part about leprosy. This is one of my favorite parts of Leviticus. And it might sound like I'm pretty desperate for a favorite part, but I think it's quite interesting and quite lovely the way it goes through leprosy. And so this is in chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, if someone has a skin or a scab or pustule or blotch, which appears to be the sore of leprosy, shall be brought to Aaron, the priest, or to one of the priests among his descendants, who shall examine the sore on his skin. If the hair on the sore has turned white and the sore itself shows it has penetrated below the skin, it is indeed the sore of leprosy. The priest, on seeing this, shall declare the man unclean. If, however, the blotch on the skin is white, it doesn't seem to have penetrated below the skin, nor has the hair turned white, the priest shall quarantine. Hey, there's that word that we love so much. Quarantine the stricken man for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall again examine him. But if you look through this, it's the closest thing we have to medical science that I'm aware of in the Bible. It is using the best knowledge that they had. It wasn't necessarily, it was, the priest was kind of both a sacrifice, but also they didn't have like medical doctors so much, but the medical examiner was the priest. And so he would go and examine and see, and they used the best scientific knowledge that they had at the time. And it's still pretty good, right? So you look at, okay, is the pustule, how far does that go? Where's the hair? It's kind of gross to read, I suppose, too. But it's like a medical examination of a leper. And the goal was not to cast out people. That was not the goal. The goal was to examine if this person had this disease or not. And I think we can maybe look at this passage in a much different light after living through a pandemic, right? Is that, boy, it seems so terrible to put someone in quarantine or whatever, but I think we understand, like if something is really highly communicable, you need to stay away from the community. You need to stay 6 feet apart. They didn't understand the 6 feet apart, apparently. And I think the leprosy was maybe more communicable than COVID-19, or at least they thought so at the time. So it was a devastating disease and they hated to do it. This was their own family members and everything. They didn't want to put people in quarantine. It wasn't like, woohoo, we're getting rid of the lepers. No, this is a serious disease. And if we let that person in, that's going to infect the entire population. And so I know that, like for instance, I've had to try to be very careful when I'm out and about. I try to, be wearing my mask and keeping 6 feet apart, because if I get sick, if I get quarantined, if I get COVID-19, or if I get exposed to COVID-19, now I've got to go into quarantine. Now I've got to cancel all the activities that are going on in Good Shepherd, because then Father Ashmore has to quarantine too, because we live in the same household and these kinds of things. So not because we're bad people, although that's another piece that's coming out of COVID-19, right? Is this kind of shame that people feel for what have I done wrong? And people maybe look at shame, like why weren't you safe? Why weren't you keeping distance or whatever? I've heard that a little bit too, that there's a shame that gets associated with the disease. That shame was on the leper as well. What have I done to deserve this punishment from God? But that wasn't really the case. So the idea was to protect the community, and you need to isolate those that are going to be infecting the community. So I think we have a new understanding of that through COVID-19, and this idea of quarantining is much more on our minds. And these chapters in chapters 13 and 14, I think, are really interesting, and just read it as a medical examination, not as a punishment, but okay, what are the facets of leprosy, and reading it as if let's try to find this, but let's try to do everything we can to make sure that we are actually quarantining for legitimate reasons and not just quarantining because it looks bad, but let's examine, is this really leprosy? And if it is, I'm sorry, but we need to move you out of the community because you're going to infect the entire community. So it's not, let's try to get rid of as many people as we can. It's let's try to save as many people as we can. That's the way to read those chapters. Saving them from punishing them for an undue punishment, or exiling them for undue reason, because it's not really leprosy. They want to make sure it's leprosy. All right, then we have, I'm going a little bit out of order, but we also have the passage about clean and unclean food, which is in chapter 11. And it's really a whole organization of what food is able to be eaten, what is clean and unclean. Again, this idea of the separation of holiness and non-holiness. And I like what Petrie does also to kind of understand, why are there these differences of these cleanliness? And he gives kind of 5 different explanations. And if you have the book, I encourage you to look at there's the hygienic explanation, aesthetic explanation, ethical explanation, anatomical explanation, and liturgical explanation of why these animals are clean and why these other ones are not. But one of the ones I thought was most interesting was the idea of some of these animals were part of the Egyptian worship. And the idea was to retool the Israelites into not worshiping the gods of Israel and to sacrifice those not to Amun-Re, but to sacrifice those to the Lord, who is the true God of Israel. And so that's a really interesting way of thinking of those clean and unclean in the context of where they came from, and to rededicate the people over and over again to God. Also in this section is one of my favorite explanations or pieces about when people talk about, do I need to take the Bible literally? And is everything in the Bible absolutely true? And is this a scientific book or not? And people try to, explain like, we don't have evolution because Genesis doesn't talk about it or whatever. One of my favorite passages against that is in chapter 11, verse 13, talking about unclean and clean. It says, of the birds, these you shall loathe, and as loathsome they shall be eaten. They shall not be eaten. The eagle, the vulture, the osprey, the kite, the various species of falcons, the various species of crows, the ostrich, the nightjar, the gull, the various species of hawk, the owl, the cormorant, the screech owl, the barn owl, so no owls, owls bad, the desert owl, the buzzard, the stork, the various species of herons, the hoopoe, and the bat. I love this passage because if someone says, we need to take whatever is in the scripture as the authentic, word of God that is going to be interpreted just like that, word for word. If that's the case, then I don't care what your science teaches you. I don't care if it says that the bat is a mammal. The bat is a bird because the Bible says so. I'm like, okay. So my point is, we had to take things in context, and they put the bat there because it had wings, right? But as we know now through science, the bat is not a bird, it is a mammal. So it gets put in this section with the birds, but that doesn't mean because the Bible says the bat is a bird, therefore I have to believe that bats are birds. I don't have to do that. And birds aren't real, as you know, of course. If you want to go on to an interesting internet rabbit hole, go Google birds aren't real. And there's a pretty fascinating thing about that. It all seems very real. It's very pretty. It's very funny. It's all tongue in cheek, but it's a funny little thing. It's like this testimony. They've all been replaced by machines. The birds that we see aren't really real. So we have all this whole thing about the eating regulations that are here in this part of Leviticus. There's a lot of commands here. There's a piece especially about why the Jewish people do not eat pork, right? So any animal that has hooves you may eat, provided it's cloven-footed and chews the cud. So these rules are for a specific time and place. These are the obligation this community is entering into, and they are accepting these rules. And many of those make sense sanitarily for the time as well. And they are to separate themselves, to be holy, to be different than the animal worship there. So those are particular rules. But then we get into the holiness code, and it goes into a whole thing about sexual rules. It spends quite a bit of time on that. And these are not for just a particular time and place, but they are for all times. And so if we are going to be holy and at all times and in all places, then that also includes the piece about sex. Sometimes people get a little bit upset and they say, we need to keep God out of the bedroom or whatever, or we're too obsessed about, sex or whatever as a church. Well, there might be some truth to that, but is sex part of life? Yes. Are there rules regarding that as well? Yes. And just like there's rules, if there are rules about what stuff to eat, right, there's also rules about sex. Now, the rules about what to eat have been lessened up a little bit, a lot bit, but the rules about sex have really not. They still are part of the holiness code of who we are as a people. And as Christians, we have accepted these things as these are still legitimate ways of how to live, and that if sex is holy, then there are also things about sex that are not holy. And it goes through this whole list. I'll go through it fairly quickly, but here's who you are not to engage in intimate relationships with. You should not your mother, not your sister, not your half-sister or stepsister, not your granddaughter, not your aunt, not your sister-in-law, not your daughter-in-law, not your mother-in-law, not your neighbor's wife. So all of these things, here it is. These are pretty clear. Now, the one that seems a little bit unclear in our times today is this is where it also talks about you shall not lie with a man as with a woman, right? And so the homosexuality teaching of the church comes from this as well. And the words are pretty strong too. It says abhorrent, that is abhorrent, and doesn't even go into much detail. It's like, I'm not even going to talk about that because it's so abhorrent. It's awful. And no animals. Okay. So here is the list of things not to, or people to not engage in sexual relations. Now, if you're a careful reader, you might say, wait a minute, there's something missing, isn't there? Is there anyone missing? Daughter, perhaps? That seems to be a missing element there. That seems odd that one was neglected, but that is also, of course, included. So the idea is that all of these things are prohibited. Now, there was back in the day, I don't know if that's still happening, but people get upset, of course, when Christians talk about our teaching that we do not support homosexual relations or whatever. And people get very upset. That's very controversial nowadays. And people bring up, well, look at all these other things in Leviticus, like it also says no shellfish. And there was a thing going around with like anti-shrimp, people wearing anti-shrimp shirts. The idea was, all right, if we can't support homosexuality, we also can't support any of these other things. Like we can't, the Bible also teaches don't eat shellfish. Well, that's in a different section. That's in the part of the code that's of a particular time and place. The law about no homosexual relations is more in this list. So if we are going to say that that the Bible prohibits homosexuality, therefore we should not allow this. It's much more if we allow homosexuality, we should also allow these relationships as well. That's the idea. Because it says that those relations are abhorrent and these are also terrible. But if we are going to allow that, that would be the argument much more than the shellfish argument. So it'd be like a no mother shirt would be the better, more solid argument if you're going to argue on the biblical basis, because this is where it falls, not with shellfish. So I know it's very controversial and people don't like hearing that, but that's the idea, that's where that prohibition falls, is with the relations, like no relations with your sister or your aunt. That's the same prohibition against having intimate relationships with someone of the same sex. And of course, the opposite would be the same. So if you're a woman, no father, no brother, no half brother, grandson, uncle, brother-in-law, son, whatever. So it's the same relationship. It is obviously written more to that male perspective, but the idea was, of course, the reverse as well. Because if you're a woman reading that, then you are applying the opposite direction as well. Which, of course, it is also taken into account. If it's not with your mother, then the opposite way. Then also would be, well, then one of them is your son. Or if you're not having sex with your father, then the obvious piece is the daughter as well. So it's implied, just not spelled out as much as you might think it should be. And there are some great quotes from Leviticus. Here is one of everyone's favorite passages, 19:18. Remember Jesus, when he's asked what's the greatest commandment? They would have quickly responded, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. We hear that in Exodus. We don't hear this until chapter 19, verse 18 of Leviticus. And so it's a very important passage that Jesus ties these two things together in a way that really hadn't been done before. And it's very, of course, profound. So one of the greatest hits, if you will, from Leviticus is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Shortly there following is, do not conform yourself, therefore, to the customs of this nation, who I am driving out of your land. Really great, important thing for us to consider, and could be great cause for our prayer and meditation. We often want to conform ourselves to what's going on in this age, but God calls us to a holiness. God calls us to be different. God calls us to be different than everybody else. So don't conform yourselves to this age, but be conformed to the holiness that I am calling you to do. And that would apply to, the sexual rules or the eating rules, right? So we don't eat meat on Fridays. That's such a small sacrifice. And not just the Fridays of Lent, but all Fridays of the year, we are called to do sacrifice. We are called to do penance. It does not have to be meat in the United States, but it does have to be something. We have to sacrifice something on Friday. That's a rule. And so if it's not meat, you can do something else. We are allowed to do that. But we are not allowed just to not do anything on Friday. And we're like, well, I'm a Catholic in my heart, and I believe in Jesus. I don't do these silly sacrifices. Don't be conformed to this age. We are called to be different. And if we order a fillet of fish instead of a hamburger at McDonald's on a Friday, for instance, people might look at us weird. Like, why are you getting a fillet of fish? The burgers are so much better. It's like, well, because I believe in God, and that's what I'm called to do. And I'm called to be a little bit different. And that's so small, we're not called to wear like phylacteries on our heads, but, just don't eat meat on a Friday. It's not that hard. It is hard though. It's sometimes hard to find something to eat on a Friday. And I usually do that thing with meat, but not always. I do. Sometimes I substitute things, especially if I go over to someone's house or something. I was like, I'm not going to eat your food or whatever. I won't ever do that. I will find some other sacrifice for that day then to do. And I've got kind of a list of other things that I can substitute, but we're supposed to do something there. So it's related here in Leviticus, make those sacrifices. And this is also very important and relevant to our world today. You shall not mistreat the alien, the foreigner, the immigrant. And so our call to treat immigrants as no differently as those who are born in our own country. We're called to treat them as no different. And people are wanting to kick immigrants out or whatever, or not give them full rights or whatever, and recall where we came from. And so that's an important thing for us to remember as well, to keep that in mind. That's also controversial, but we are called to be different, right? We are not called to be like all the others. We are called to be great examples of holiness and faithfulness, and to remember our own history, that we as descendants of the Jewish people, we also have a common history of being brought out from Egypt. So those are some great passages for us to consider from Leviticus. So that pretty much, we're not going to go into that. Sometimes I've done like my top 10 quotes or whatever. But that pretty much covers what I was going to share from Leviticus, and hopefully that's helpful, and maybe you don't hate Leviticus as much as you might have when you came in, and just so there's some real gems in there that sometimes get overlooked. And like my my friend Father John said to skip it maybe. And I think there's a lot of stuff to get through, but it's also something that we really shouldn't skip, or at least read the Cliff Notes version on. All right, so I am now going to unmute you all. And so then I have, so Dawn, you had mentioned, right, the doing the penance is not required for the forgiveness, but is the idea that we are going to carry forth and be changed. And so it's a moment to set our lives in a different way. So it's a way to put into practice what we have learned from our reconciliation. So the forgiveness still happens whether you do your penance or not, but we're really supposed to do our penance. It's kind of completed, if you will, through our penance. So this forgiveness still happens, but it's completed. And I try as much as I can. I don't always have great ideas, but I try to get a penance that matches the major sin or sins that I have heard. So if someone says, I've been rude to my brother, I might say, okay, say a prayer for your brother, or I want you to go do something nice for your brother, or I've been really disrespectful to my wife or whatever. Okay, I want you to do 3 concrete actual things for your wife as your penance or whatever. So I try to match those up. The idea is it sets us on the path then to live what we want to live. Anybody else have a question? I also see Dawn's other question, but I'll open it up for a second here. I'll check on the Facebook as well, and the YouTube. So Dawn was asking how many common people followed these rules, like if they were hungry or just ate the animal available, or the sexual impurity and menstrual rules. There was an interesting commentary on that as well in this Petrie book about the loss of blood was the idea of becoming unclean. So all of those elements were something about losing that life. There was some element of losing life. If the life is contained in the blood, then you lose life, if you will. And so that was that idea. It's, again, hard for us to understand that, but that was kind of the idea. If the blood is in the life, and whenever we lose blood, we lose life. And if God says, choose life, don't choose death, then anything that causes the loss of blood is unclean or unholy because it takes life away from us. Sure. And then about birth control today, people don't know the church teaching, don't agree or understand. Right. So I don't know. I don't know how many common, that would be speculation about that. And that's a fairly good thing to wonder about, how many people actually followed those things. And
probably nothing to be talked about here.
Well, I'm not talking about birth control. I'm talking about I'm talking about old back in Leviticus time. Yes. But it is probably a fair comparison. That was probably a relatable number, a relatable percentage of people who knew the rules but still didn't do them, or didn't understand them. It was probably a similar proportion, but that would be speculation. I mean, as many people would say stereotypically about Catholics today is, I can just go to the bar and do whatever I want and sin on Friday, and then I'll just go to confession on Saturday and get that taken care of. I mean, I don't really hear many people actually saying that, but that's the stereotype. I imagine that kind of stereotype might have been done in those times too. I can do whatever I want. I'll offer a sacrifice at the temple and call it good. So, I mean, I imagine there was kind of the same stereotype and there. So what about all that blood that gets on the altar? What a smell. Who cleaned it up? Well, I guess there's a reason for incense, right? That's probably why they have the incense, was to cover up that smell. There were other like altar servers, or The altar servers have it so easy today. They don't have to clean up blood usually. But they would have to do those kind of things probably. The acolytes.
I think the part I found most difficult to swallow is the fact that a woman gives birth and she has to atone for that and give sacrifices to be forgiven for that. I mean, I understand about the way they look at blood and the menstruation and all of those kinds of things, but come on, she brings new life into the world and she has to atone for that. Now, the logic on there just escapes me completely.
Yeah, it's possible, and I'm not positive about this, but it also might connect to Genesis and connecting to that punishment or whatever that we heard, that through labor pains you shall give birth, and maybe connecting it to the sin of Eve, and the reason that you are having to give birth in this way and through pain and through blood is because of the sin of Eve. That could be a possibility of that's why this was seen as I need to atone for my participation in the sin of Eve. So that would be a possibility.
I like the fact that you're saying that the Leviticus rules and regulations seem to be moving farther away from all of the violence that was in Genesis, but there's still a heck of a lot of violence there. If you do this, you should be killed. If you did that, you should be killed. If you did something else, you should be killed. You know, it's quite violent.
Sure. And again, it's an evolution of, and sometimes, I mean, let's see here. I'm not necessarily saying God has empty threats or God is teaching through threat. Or that was their interpretation of that. But sometimes the threat of punishment is reason enough to avoid doing those things in of itself. If you do this, you're going to be grounded. Okay, I won't do it or whatever, you know. So not that we want to ground, but this is the consequences that you will face. And so sometimes those grave consequences, again, if it's a sin against holiness, and it's a sin against life. Well, what's the price that needs to be paid? Well, your own life, or your life that can be communicated through the animal sacrifice. Which is, again, that was part of the idea, is the punishment that I am supposed to take on now will go through this animal, and that was that sacrifice that was made. It should be my life that is being taken, but because of God is merciful, I can offer this sacrifice, and through this blood, my sins can be forgiven. Any other thoughts or questions? Patty, did you have something? Okay. I didn't know if you were trying to unmute or... Anybody else? Marilyn, Carol, anybody else on the Facebook? I can check the YouTube. And again, hopefully this has been helpful. We will jump to Numbers next time, and which is also not anyone's necessarily favorite. Or thoughts or questions? Did you have some? Not necessarily everyone else's favorite as well, but and then we get on to Deuteronomy, which is just kind of a whole kind of retelling of what we've already heard, but from a different perspective.
I do have one more question.
Yes, please. Karen.
According to the footnotes, chapter 27 on was like an appendix.
Yep.
Why would all of these rules and regulations have an appendix unless they were many, many years later, you know, like we have our Constitution of the United States and then we have all these amendments. Mm-hmm. If that was the case, it seems to me that it's not an appendix of what was already said. It's just more of the same.
From chapter 27?
Yes, chapter 27. There's a footnote down there that says that is considered an appendix.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if I talked so much about it in the previous two books, but the authorship of these first 5 books of the Bible is very complicated. And there is kind of this 4 source theory that there were kind of 4 different groups of authors that kind of adapted and added. And so it might have been part of that history of that gets added on later. And they thought well, this is important, and we're going to put this on as well. So the evolution and the authorship of that is a little bit complicated. And I think that these are the, I think these look like there's some kind of, I didn't talk about this section at all really, but clarifications of things that, yes, they've happened before, but they perhaps needed some clarification, especially at that time. And we see that in our own day too. We would like the constitutional amendments, or I need to clarify this rule, or sometimes you have like an addition that needs to go into the code of conduct, or an addition that needs to go into the student handbook or whatever. We are adding this section now because we have to. This is very important. Like with the whole virtus things. I mean, there was a code of conduct or a student handbook, and now we need to add this other section because we've had some problems here and there's been some confusion. We're going to add this piece. So I think that's the same kind of thing with this piece of Leviticus.
And as you had mentioned, Leviticus is definitely proof that you cannot take every word in the Bible as being holy and absolutely true, because God really doesn't want us to be that violent and mean and, eye for an eye, for a tooth. Whatever happened, that capital punishment came back into being vogue, that we had to rewrite our whole catechism because of capital punishment changing in the 90s. So I think it's nice that the church is evolving, and I still have hope for a few other things to change too, like the birth control issue. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Thank you for your time, Father, as usual. It was very interesting.
Great. And if nothing else, it's good for us to understand our history. And so that's another piece as we look at Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. Part of that is an understanding where we came from.
And be very grateful for living now and not back then.
Sure, yeah. Although we have our own problems, so.
Well, you noticed that, did you? Thank you, Father.
All right. Well, anyone else on note? Thanks so much. And Don, I like this idea of writing this rule of life for all of us. So that's a great idea. So, all right. Well, thanks so much. And we'll see you next week for Numbers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.